Welcome back to the Tour Today show. My name is Steve Fleck. Every day there is racing at the Tour. We will talk about the highs and the lows, the thrills and the spills, the tragedies and the triumphs at the Tour, aka La Grande Boucle. On each episode of the Tour Today, I will have a special guest on the show with me. And today I'm very pleased to have with me as my guest the #1 ranked Zwift rider and racer in the world. And he just recently got back to #1, so we are very pleased to have him on the show with us today. Welcome, Holden Comeau.
Hi, Steve. Thanks so much. It's great to be here. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, this is fun. This is almost like a parallel sort of universe, the whole world of Zwift and virtual racing, and we're going to take a deep dive into that a little bit later on in the show. But I want to thank everyone who has tuned in to watch us today on the Tour Today show. You can find me on Twitter. That's the best spot to send out questions, comments, input, etc. You can find me on Twitter at Steve Fleck. Holden, where's the best spot for people to find you on social media?
I'm on Facebook, I think primarily, and Twitter and Instagram as well. But I think Facebook is where I do most of my Zwift-related activities. I live stream through Facebook sometimes.
Awesome. Great. Well, Holden, if you just sit tight for a minute or two, I'm going to sum up stage 15 today. It was exciting. It was expected to be the Grand Colombier, 15-plus kilometer brutal climb with ramps up to 12, 13, 14% in that final run to the finish. And it all came down to a battle with the GC favorites and the young Slovenian rider, the 21-year-old sensation of the Tour, Tadej Pogačar, winning at the summit just ahead of his countryman Primož Roglič. Australian Richie Porte ended up in third. Jumbo-Visma, as expected, set this up perfectly for Roglič with relentless tempo on the front. First from Wout van Aert. George Bennett then took over. Then it was Tommy Dumoulin. Then it was Sepp Kuss. And they set it up for Roglič to attack. And he went away with Pogačar when Pogačar put in a big acceleration in the last kilometer. One of the big stories of this stage, and if you did watch it, you watched Egan Bernal, the defending champion, as well as Nairo Quintana crack. And it was so unusual to see those two great climbers, two of the best pure climbers in the sport of cycling, just crack under the relentless pressure of Jumbo-Visma on the front with the GC group. And they were going backwards. They lost big chunks of time. Both Bernal and Quintana now outside of the top 10 on the GC. We'll get to that GC standing momentarily. So again, just a quick summary on the stage. Pogačar finishes in first. He is riding for the UAE Team Emirates. And again, this kid is only 21 years old. Sensational riding. His countryman Primož Roglič in second. Roglič will retain the yellow jersey. Great ride from the Australian. Richie Porte sitting now in the top 10 overall on the GC. We'll get to the GC standings momentarily. Porte, a great ride for Trek Segafredo. So to those yellow jersey standings, as mentioned, Roglič will retain the yellow jersey. 40 seconds back to Tadej Pogačar, his countryman, and those two are really starting to pull away. A good ride today from Rigoberto Urán from EF Pro Cycling. He will take over in third. Angel Lopez sits in fourth place for Astana. Adam Yates is in fifth. There was a bit of an attack on the final climb up to the Colombier summit from Adam Yates, and Yates is going well. He's just 2 minutes back. Porte moves up into sixth spot at 2:13. Mikel Landa, he rode well. Landa has moved up steadily from 10th spot. He's sitting in sixth, or seventh, I should say. Enric Mas from the Movistar team in eighth. Quintana just barely hanging on to a spot in the top 10 now over 5 minutes back. And Tom Dumoulin really riding in a support role for Roglič. He sits in 10th spot. No change in the green jersey. Sam Bennett still hangs on to the green jersey, sitting in first spot in that competition. He was able to get in within the time cutoff today. That's really going to be the challenge for Bennett over these brutally mountainous stages over from now right really through until the end of the Tour, is for Sam Bennett to get in under the time cutoff for the stage. He did that today. White jersey, Tadej Pogačar, still hanging on in first place there. Benoit Cosnefoy, the young French rider, still hanging on in first spot in the KOM. But really what's going to happen now with just mountains every stage from here on in, it's going to be Pogacar and Roglic threatening Cosnefoy for that polka dot jersey. Changing the team competition. It was a great ride from Team Movistar today. They moved well into the lead in the team competition, now 14 minutes ahead of Jumbo-Visma. Coming up on the rest, after the rest day, it is another mountainous stage. The riders will take Monday off, and then Tuesday they will tackle a 164-kilometer stage from La Tour de Pin to Villard-de-Lans, with a finish, almost a mountain finish, finish on a summit there at the ski resort of Villard-de-Lans. Watch out for the sprint competition. This could get interesting. The sprint, intermediary sprint, comes up 40 kilometers into the stage, and it's going to be a battle between Sagan and Bennett and their respective teams, Bora Hansbrough and Dunasek Quickstep, to see who gets the points there. So that's it in terms of a summary. We're now going to go back to Holden. Thanks for sitting tight there, Holden. As mentioned, you are the #1 ranked Zwift racer and rider in the world. What kind of background got you into this? And tell us a bit about your background and how it is you've taken the Zwift racing by storm, and what you love about it.
Yeah, thank you. So I would not have ever expected to be in the position that I am right now as an athlete. I'm on the older side as far as athletics go, elite level athletes go. And this is really my third athletic career. I was a swimmer for most of my youth and through college. I swam at Penn State, was an NCAA All-American, tried to make the Olympic team in 2000, the U.S. Olympic team, went to trials and finished top 25 in the 100 and 200 freestyle. So I was a mid-distance freestyler, sprint to mid-distance freestyler. And I think ultimately that is what has set me up now for success on Zwift later on in life, which is interesting, because in between my swimming career and my cycling career, I had been a professional triathlete for about 8 years. And triathlon was a great experience for me, although the entire time I always felt as though something was missing. It was just this sense that I had, and I guess I felt this way coming out of college as well. When my swimming career was over, I felt as though I just really hadn't done everything I wanted to do, as though I was just had this internal frustration that I just wasn't being my best self as an athlete. With swimming, I think I felt a bit more optimized, but triathlon was always a struggle. And I just didn't have the immediate self-reflection at the time to recognize that frustration was really stemming from the fact that I'm just physiologically a sprinter, and and I was trying to force myself to, start out with Olympic distance racing and ran the gamut all the way up to Ironman racing towards the end of my career. And, I found some success in triathlon. I wasn't ever at the very front of the pack. I never qualified for Kona as a pro, which is always sort of a regret, something that I would want to try to accomplish at some point in life as an age grouper, just because I think it's so cool. But what triathlon did do is introduce me to riding the bike. I retired from racing triathlon about 8 years ago and started a company, a data analytics company. And it was actually out of that professional interest, in my business interest, that I discovered Zwift. And while I was building that company, I wasn't really very athletic. I was running, I sort of quit triathlon cold turkey. I had assumed that my athletic life was well behind me. And my business partner told me to check out Zwift, thought I would like it. And it was mostly from a data and technology perspective. I'm a technologist, chief technology officer, and data officer at the company. So that was my interest. I started riding, quickly got hooked, and about a year and a half ago, signed up for the 2019 Zwift Nationals, and won the race, which was amazing. I been racing a bit prior to that nationals race. And so I was familiar, but it was really, that was the moment where I recognized that I was pretty good at this. And, it's been a wild ride ever since. I've been really committed and racing multiple times a week. But I mentioned that swimming experience. That's really what it is.
Yep.
I've synergized, understanding how to ride a bike, and I trained outside and did some racing on my bike before, and obviously some triathlon training. So I knew how to ride a bike, but really the effort itself on Zwift, and why I think I've had success, is because I am really good at 30 to 90 second efforts, and that goes a long way in a Zwift race.
What sort of physical characteristics are needed? The physiological characteristics, you mentioned some of them, but what are some of those physiological characteristics needed to race well on Zwift? Because you kind of summed up the two extremes of the endurance sports success spectrum right there. I mean, you can look at Ironman racing, 8 or 9 hours, and it's purely aerobic and just hanging on forever. Versus swimming, which is very sprint oriented in the more popular sort of swim events, the 50, the 100, even up to a 200. That's almost a pure anaerobic, type of event. So what are some of the physical characteristics you need to race well on Zwift?
Yeah, I think it definitely. I feel as though I'm in comparable sort of shape, and I train and think of myself in a similar way to when I'm in. I would say a Zwift race is very similar in physiological strain as a swimming workout. Mm-hmm. So the training I did for swimming, which is an hour, 60 to 90 minutes of really high intensity intervals, with short periods of rest in between those intervals, is very similar to what we experience in the race itself. So there's moments in the Zwift race where you're going super hard, we're putting out tons of power and responding to different things, the terrain and your competitors. But then there's other moments where you're off and you're resting. So as far as physiological characteristics, I think the ability to do that, to go up and down, to both be able to spike power, but to also be able to maximize how quickly you're able to recover in those moments where you're off, can lead you to success. And there's that's my profile, and I do pretty well in Zwift racing. And I think there's other athletes who I compete against who are in a similar situation. But what's really exciting about Zwift is that it's also bringing in lots of other athlete physiological types, where there's definitely room for endurance climbers in some instances, and particularly now when we're seeing more teams that are getting organized and you're working together and trying to gel with everyone's different strengths and weaknesses. It's getting pretty interesting, and I think it's never going to be, at least I hope it's not ever, a direct replication of outdoor road riding. That's not what it is. It's a totally different thing, but there's room for the same sort of framework of how you approach a road race. There's sprinters, there's climbers, there's TT specialists, there's all-rounders. That sort of framework can be applied to Zwift, and that's what's interesting, keeps it interesting.
So if you watch, a typical Zwift race, and I've commented on some, and I've watched, others race on Zwift, it's very different than, say, a stage that we've been watching at the Tour de France, where the riders sort of roll out easy and they're kind of rolling along. They're even chatting sort of with one another. But that first 2 or 3 minutes of a Zwift race, it's insane. It is like full gas for the first 5 minutes. And then it kind of backs off, a little bit, settles in for a bit. And as you had mentioned, the races are typically only 45 minutes to an hour, an hour long. And then it just sort of ramps up from there. Walk me through how a typical sort of Zwift race unfolds. And keep in mind, it's going to be terrain dependent, and you hit on some of that. Sure. Some of the races are flat, some of the races got big climbs, but it's very different than racing in the real world.
Yeah, so about 45 minutes. The longest we'll see is an hour and 15 minutes. Occasionally 90 minutes of racing, but it is everything is condensed. There's some things that make it unique. such as the start, where it's full gas right from the get-go. And I would equate that maybe to a cyclocross start or a mountain bike start, where there's a whole shot and everyone's trying to position. So we go real hard right from the get-go. I don't know why. It's sort of unnecessary because it doesn't really factor into the results of the race. I think what makes that happen is because in Zwift Racing, you've got this countdown timer before it says go, and everyone's in the pen. While that countdown is going, you have no idea what the competitors are riding at. So I think everyone just gets a little nervous and they think like, oh, someone might be, ramping up their power at 10 watts per kilo. And as soon as it drops to 0, they're going to shoot off the front. So there is some just anticipation where you're blind to what your competitors are doing at that moment until it goes. So everyone tends to go a little bit harder to be safe. But that's really the only reason. Other than that, there's, I mentioned that it's condensed. The formatting is condensed. There's the same tactics are deployed throughout the race. People try to attack. Teams try to get organized. There's sometimes, intermediate points that we're chasing after. There's KLM banners, etc. It's, the formatting is very similar to road racing. But since it's so much shorter, the response from the group, we call it the blob, is really quick. A 5-second break up the road is dangerous. That's far. So you can't let 5 or 10 seconds go because someone could get away with that time gap. So we respond really quickly to those moves. And I think that's, it's just, if we think about what might happen outdoors, just try to, scale it all down a little bit more. I think one of the other things that's very unique to Zwift Racing is that although sometimes breakaways will work, and there needs to be in order for that to work, there needs to be good organization from teams that are actually racing. And sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes there's just a lot of individual racers who are there and less teamwork, team tactics competing against each other. But one of the things that I think is really unique to Zwift Racing, and I equate this to the tactic and strategy of a breakaway happening on a road race. In Zwift, the risk of getting dropped is always present. Right. That happens a lot. And that's a tactic and a strategy that we use to win races. You can use that method. There's things that you can do to position your avatar in the blob to put people at more risk of getting dropped, open up gaps a little bit. And like I said, a 5-second gap can actually be a lot. So if you can get someone or a group of people in a position where there might be a 3 to 5 second gap and they're towards the back of the pack, that can be really dangerous and they could get dropped. And that comes into play, and that's a proactive strategy that we use to compete against each other. I think that's a little bit different than riding outdoors where riders getting dropped because they're tired. That still happens in Zwift Racing. You get tired and you can't keep up, but it's also because you're getting caught out because other riders are doing something purposefully to attack you and block you.
Now, there's things in the Zwift on the gamification side, the gaming side of Zwift, the power ups and certain things you can do. You mentioned like positioning. I love how you call the peloton a blob. In the blob that you need to sort of be aware of. What are some of the things that are unique to Zwift, the game side of it, that you need to know to race well, on the Zwift platform?
Yeah. So Steve, I could talk about that all day long, and that's what I love about it. And that's what's really sort of connected with me, because the gaming piece to it is really interesting and really significant. And there's a lot of that. There's the obvious things like the power-ups that you can use. Those are very obvious, and those let everyone know that this is a video game. But it goes into a lot more depth than just those power-ups. I've always been someone who likes to play video games, and there is, when I play games, and I'm sure other people who play video games can recognize this, there's a lot of repetition that goes into how you play the game that ultimately leads to mastering certain aspects and skills within that video game. And I think that's common. That's a common approach, and it doesn't really matter what game you're playing. There's a way to master certain skills, and it usually is associated with repetition. Zwift is no different. The way and most of that gaming for me, at least what I focus on, is how I control my avatar and the positioning relative to others in the game. When I want to move forward in the pack, I have a sense for how fast I'm going, how much power I'm putting out, what the terrain looks like. And I've learned all those things because I've done it over and over and over again. I've raced over 500 times in the last couple years.
Wow.
And I don't honestly do any training anymore. I don't work out because there's always a race happening. I wake up in the weekday morning and find a race around 6 o'clock in the morning and do the race. And it's really rare that I'll get on Zwift and do anything other than a race or just do a ride or even do a workout. It's all racing all the time. Different races have different amounts of effort and stress that you put into them. But because you can race so often, you learn these unique skills that help you gain an advantage, and you learn how to win a race. Yep. And there's something to be said for that. I think that's a skill that I definitely tried hard to master when I was a triathlete, winning a race, and when I was a swimmer, and I never had as much of an opportunity to race. Triathlon, I raced maybe a dozen times a year. And with Zwift Racing, I get to race every single morning, and you can try things out and figure out new little tricks and tips. And it really goes a long way. I would say if in road racing, you've got bike handling skills. That's sort of like this X factor thing that helps you succeed as a bike racer. Yeah. You take away, and it doesn't really have anything to do with fitness or strength. You take that away in Zwift, and you substitute bike handling skills for gaming skills, which is not about your fitness and strength, but it's this other thing that really contributes significantly to success.
Was that your advantage that came to the fore? This ability, that repetition, the gaming side of it, that allowed you to beat some of these riders we're seeing racing in the Tour de France. You were racing them, the guys that are riding the Tour stage today. You raced them and you beat them in races, earlier in the year. And it wasn't about fitness,
Obviously not.
Yeah, a bit of it is about fitness, or a lot of it is about fitness, but ultimately beating them. I heard comments that they were frustrated by the gamification side of it. A lot of the World Tour pros that sort of jumped on to Zwift because that's all they had. Like there was no racing going on. Some of them were on lockdown. They couldn't leave wherever they were living, and they were only riding on Zwift. And you were racing them. Is the reason you were beating them the gamification side, or was it the fitness side?
100% the gamification side. I mean, it's funny. Richie Port raced today. He was third, right? Yep. And I raced him earlier this year. He was when COVID first started happening. He followed me on Zwift, and it was like I was blushing, and told my teammates that I got this follow because I had done a race with him and I had beat him in some instance. And there's countless other examples of guys who just jump on. In some instances, they're coming on in bigger, more organized races, but they're also, these guys are trying to fly under the radar, and they're just jumping on into Zwift races as part of their training to check it out. And it's always really thrilling to be able to race with them. And it's also really rare that any of them are in being competitive in any way with the top of the Zwift race crowd. They're obviously much stronger than us from a fitness perspective, but they're missing out almost entirely on that gaming skill piece, which isn't that difficult to learn. Give them a couple months and they can figure it out. I think that there hasn't been too many examples of World Tour pros who have come on who have really seemed to be bought in, have been motivated to try to figure that out. I think it's just a matter of time, really, before that happens. I mean, I'm 42 years old and on my third athletic career, and I don't, it's not. I don't think I should be beating World Tour pros, but it makes me just value and understand just how important those tactics and game skills really are in influencing the outcomes.
Is that opportunity going to come up later on this year? Because I know the UCI and Zwift have forged a relationship, and they are later on in the year. I don't know the date. Perhaps you know. There will be a UCI Zwift World Championships, and a rainbow jersey awarded. Is that going to be, or is that a focus for you this year? And then how is that going to change? Some of these World Tour pros might actually start taking it, not with all due respect to you and those who have focused on the Zwift, but might that be the opportunity for some of them to start take this a little bit more seriously?
Yeah, I hope so. I have to imagine there's been a few other moments in Zwift's sort of progression where I think we're starting to see a lot more buy-in from not just the athletes, but also the broader organizations and entities that are tied to professional cycling, that are finding more and more value in what esports can offer. So brands and sponsors, of course, are going to be interested in this space. There's a ton of media opportunity there, and a lot of value that could be driven back to those sponsors. I think the team owners are starting to see value in that sort of the activation that is possible for bringing their riders into these races. And I think the athletes themselves are starting to recognize that that initial frustration that they had was in fact rooted in a misunderstanding of how to actually apply themselves in this environment. That'll come around, and there's what else is going to motivate people more than being able to zip up a rainbow jersey, and that's exciting. So that's happening in the second week of December, which has been pushed back. The COVID, put everything in limbo for a while. So it was just, it was supposed to be earlier. I think it was supposed to be actually initially this month. But just recently, everyone was starting to get worried that it was going to be canceled outright. But it was recently announced that it's actually going to be in December, and it's going to be contested completely remote. I think the original plan was that there's going to be qualification races that might have been remote, and then the actual UCI championships would be live in person from a studio and race together. But the plan this year is second week of December. It'll be a completely remote experience. How to get there, how you can actually qualify to race is still up in the air. I can tell you that as soon as I heard this was happening a year and a half ago, it's been a focus. It's really been the only thing I've cared about. And it's here and it's upon us. So it's very much a focus of mine. What's exciting and also really frustrating is that how the path to getting to that world championship is difficult. And I can appreciate that difficulty. Zwift is a really disruptive technology, and it's disrupting how athletes get to their world championships in that sequence. So, if you're a professional cyclist, getting to world championship is a pretty clear and defined model. You become a pro, you get a license, you join a team, you go through qualifiers. That infrastructure, it hasn't been defined in Zwift, So the path right now is essentially mimicking the outdoor riding. So I think those racers and anyone who is currently eligible to race in an outdoor road world championship is going to effectively be eligible to race the esports championship. But what do? And there's a number of other riders who are in the same position as I am that are going to have to figure out how to get there, because we don't hold UCI licenses. We're not on pro teams, and most importantly, we are not currently eligible for a National Federation drug testing pool. And I've always been, my whole life, I've been a really sort of passionate anti-drug athlete, and it's just always been sort of a really sensitive thing for me for personal reasons. And that's something I really would love to see. I love the idea that Zwift as a real disruptive technology has the ability to sort of rewrite the whole premise around how athletes are considered to be eligible for a testing pool. It never made sense to me that eligibility for a testing pool was reserved for like the top crest, like the topmost pinnacle of sport, the select few, when there's a whole swath of the other athletes underneath who, are never getting tested, never seeing that. Zwift is potentially has the ability to change that. So that's what I'm working through right now. I've been communicating with USAC to try to figure out how we can potentially license myself and my team, fast track our ability to enter into a drug testing pool, and then ultimately get ourselves into that World Championships. So we've got a lot of work to do in 2 months, but we'll see.
So much going on, and you're right. It's massively disruptive, and it's amazing, Holden, what the pandemic has done. I think it's accelerated sort of all of this and brought it all to the fore. I mean, Zwift is having a year of years in only their 5th year of business, and have really risen, to the top here, and it's just been explosive. For them, the growth, people using the platform, the brand, the name, etc., all of that. Longer term here, I was just thinking about this, is that, e-gaming has talked about getting into the Olympic Games. And I'm thinking they're thinking more of this traditional sort of, e-gaming you talked about being a gamer and, getting that into the Olympic Games. But might this be really a more legitimate sort of lever in to the Olympic Games, this racing on Zwift or whatever electronic sort of or digital platform it is? What do you think?
Absolutely. I think that, so Eric Min, one of the founders of Zwift, the CEO, has been publicly vocal about his want to include cycling esports, or Zwift's version of cycling esports in the Olympics. And I don't see why that wouldn't be possible, particularly now that there's going to be a World Championships, awarded and recognized. I definitely think that is a possibility, and I also think that it would be a really welcome and exciting addition to the Olympic Games, and really to the sport of cycling as a new discipline. It's a really exciting experience if you think about the entertainment value that's created and what's possible there. It is in my mind, I'm obviously biased, but it's a really compelling racing experience. I went to I tell a story that right after I won national championships last year, I went to it was a marketing and promotional event that Zwift put on in New York City that had about 100 people were invited. It was a party more or less, but it had some pro riders who were there racing up on stage. And it was thrilling to see, I wasn't racing, I was there for the party, but to have pro athletes, right up in front of me. And the projector was, beaming the actual race. There's other riders racing at home around the world. A really thrilling, unique version of cycling that, you could really, you could see it. You could see the athletes suffering. I'll never forget, one of the athletes got dropped from the race, who was on stage sitting there, and you could just see the disappointment in his face, and he had to ride out the rest of the race in front of the crowd, having gotten dropped. And you never see that kind of emotion and engagement with the Tour de France version of cycling. So I think it's warranted. There's a lot that goes into it. There's depth to the strategy and the tactics. There's a unique physiology that's required in order to play the sport. All the things that go into making a sport engaging and legitimate has been encapsulated in what cycling esports is, and I think it's warranted to be put up against all the other great sports in the world, including the Olympics. I'm certainly an advocate, and of course I'm definitely biased. And I've never been so close to making the Olympics before. I guess with swimming I was pretty close, but I'm going to be way too old by the time cycling esports gets there. But it's fun.
You've been watching the Tour Today show. My guest today has been the #1 ranked Zwift racer and rider in the world, Holden Comeau. Holden, thank you so much for this. It's been a fascinating discussion. There's so much, possibility here, and I appreciate you sharing, all of this with us.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it.
Remember, tomorrow is a rest day. The Tour de France will be taking a day of rest for the riders, and like the riders, we'll be taking the day off on Monday as well, and we will be back on Tuesday for the next episode of the Tour Today show. My guest will be not a bike industry person, not an expert on anything related to cycling and endurance sport, but he will be and is a genuine fan of the sport of cycling. My good friend Devashish Paul will be joining us on Tuesday, the next edition of the Tour Today show. I'm Steve Fleck on behalf of the whole team at Endurance Zone TV. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you all back on Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time for the next episode of the Tour Today show.